here, just quickly, you can see that, GT metrics measures, forward loaded time on average is 6.9
Load
seconds.
time has been a very, very big factor when it comes to optimizing, when it comes to conversions as well.
Hello, and welcome to the Crazy Optimizer, presented by the TheWPHelp. I'm Michael Borgelt.
I'm Abdul.
And that's Abdul, the Crazy Optimizer himself, in the house with us today. Today, we're going to go through a little bit of a report that we've created, and then we're going to actually jump over to GT metrics as we have the links kind of saved. And today, we're going to talk about the page details that you see on GT metrics. So the fully loaded time, the total page size, and the number of requests. So here you can see quickly the old site, the site that was previously launched that was running on their server. You can see that, pretty low scores, but the fully load time was 37 seconds, almost 38 seconds. 900 megabytes and 290 requests. And then once we did the optimization, the fully loaded time was 2 seconds, 250 kilobytes, and only 13 requests. So a pretty significant reduction on this site that we've created here. So we just dive in a little bit more of the details of the seconds and what we went down, the page scores, comparing the old and the new, the number of requests, the time to first byte. We talk about that, as we'll learn today is a site speed issue that we definitely want to address, and it's usually addressed at the server level. Page speed or page size, you can see the difference there, significant reduction there, which obviously then gets to the number of requests that reduce that as well. And then just quickly, we show the Google Page Insights tool as well that has 22 for mobile and 57 for desktop, and then 98 for after it's been optimized, the 98 on mobile and 100 on desktop. So I have the two GT metrics scores pulled up here, and I think we'll just kind of dive right into it. So I think one of the first things we should just talk about is the fully loaded time and why this is important and how different people measure it, right? Like, people measure it differently, Abdul, based on what we've seen, even with tools that we've used and even tools we're currently using right now. We're trying to convince them to measure it differently, right, of how they measure fully loaded and load time just in general. So why don't you talk a little bit about that?
Okay. So I think in the last video, we touched upon the page speed score, and we wanted to do the page load time and size and request today. So I think, in my opinion, for me, when I'm optimizing a website or the team is optimizing the website, scores are important, right? Because they show you how well you're doing on the best practices. But from a user's perspective, the biggest thing that they feel is the load time. So that's the main importance of it, because a website, though it's not generally possible, but I have seen it sometimes that it can have very good page speed scores, but not a good load time. But normally it's not possible. If you have a good page speed score, you'll always have a good load time because you've done the best practices. But just for the sake of argument, like, people don't care about the score, right? For the score side, it's the website owner that cares, because they know how well the website is built and it's following all the best practices. But if it's not loading fast, the user doesn't care. So the first and the only key metric that comes into effect with the user is the load time. So I think for us as well, it's very important, like, to make sure that you're loading fast. And it's so many studies done, like, in the past few years, load time has been a very, very big factor when it comes to optimize, when it comes to conversions as well, when it comes to user experience as well. And now with Google's new update coming on anytime this year, we are expected to see Chrome. In Chrome, they'll be flagging websites that are slow, and that will it still affects your rankings, but now it will start affecting it more. So I think with people, like, because most of the people these days quote studies of 4 seconds, or you have to be under 4 seconds. But I think we mentioned it in a previous video somewhere, because that study is also from 2015. So I think, like, it's even gotten worse now. Like, people expect websites to load even faster than 4 seconds. That's why, like, for us, 4 seconds is not good enough. We always make sure that we are somewhere around under 2 seconds. Some of our websites even go under 1 second. But 2 seconds is a good sweet spot. If you anywhere from like 1.5 to 2.5 seconds, you're in the safe zone, where you can say, like, even with this updates that are coming up, with people getting more demanding on speed, you're in the safe zone.
Yeah, and I think that's a great point that you mentioned about, obviously Google wants a great user experience. That's why it's a ranking factor. And one of the reasons, how quickly a site loads is a user experience metric, right? So having a site that loads quickly is very important, and I believe does contribute to increased rankings. We have seen sites that jump onto our platform to have an increase in conversion rate of 18 to 30% based on the studies that we've done, just due to having a quicker loading site, which makes sense, right? People are able to bounce through, get more information if they're on their mobile devices or even on the web. I mean, somebody that's loading in 37 seconds previously, probably not having a lot of fun bouncing around that website looking for information, right? So that's one of the things that we've seen. We also seen an increase in number of users. And just recently with the new Google rollout that just happened this last couple of days, we've seen sites move up in regards to speed as well. And, you've mentioned the user experience of the tags coming out that Google's going to start applying to sites. You don't think that's going to affect conversion rates? You're crazy, right? As soon as somebody sees that, they're going to get conditioned just to go back and go to the next result, because it's not going to be a good user experience. So here, just quickly, you can see that, GT Metrics measures, a fully loaded time on average is 6.9 seconds. I think we would all agree that's way too long in general, just even if it's an average site. But that just shows how poor the web is performing right now in regards to sites overall in general, as GT Metric has measured them.
Yep. And I think one point that you also mentioned is how different tools track it differently, right? So you're right, because we have seen it in action. We have seen when we use different tools, we do get different times. So when we started investigating, one key thing that came out was that the way they calculate time. So in my opinion, GT Metrics is one of the closest one to an actual user, of how an actual user would go through your website. But some tools, because when you do a lot of optimization, you have to do a lot of things. That's why we get good load times, a very good page speed, page size, good scores, because we prioritize the page. Like, we know that we have to give the first fold to the user as soon as possible to start using the website. But the problem is that certain tools are not programmed to do it like that. Certain tools are programmed to wait for the whole thing to load. So when a system is not even ready to give them the information because they've not started interacting with the page, so definitely the page load time is higher. So I've seen in my experience that GT Metrics is one of the best, of the closest one to an actual user, because we do test it on our systems as well on our end, and we find it very close to what GT Metrics gets. But we do use GT Metrics because it's accepted, because we do get our own tools as well where we measure, but GT Metrics being one of the widely recognized ones, so that's where we form a baseline on.
Yeah, and I think that, and we use Google Page Insights, because those are the two biggest ones that people use. Will you talk a little bit about like fully loaded versus page loaded, and what's that actually called, and how people recognize that differently?
Can you go to the timings?
Sure.
Okay, so the fully loaded time, basically what happens is that once a user hits enter, once your user, like say this valleyplumbing.com, they send the request. The first thing which is there is TTFB, which is called time to first byte. So that is like a metric that is very much dependent on the server and the host you're on, because we've seen, like, if once the request goes on, so you have these three parts that are in there: the redirect, the connect, and the backend, right? So redirect is if there's any redirects happening, or if like it's redirecting from non-secure to secure. So if there's a time for that, how long did the server take to connect it? How long did it take to start the request and send the first byte back to the page? So the lower this is, the better it is. And there are certain elements where your website can also affect it, but like 90% is this hosting that you're using that is affecting this. Because we do have a list of bad hosts as well internally, where we know that the TTFB will be higher. But if you go to any good host, they are actively working on this score and on this number to make sure that your websites are loading, like the first byte is as soon as possible. So anything under 200 milliseconds is good.
Yeah, and I would say under what time? How much time?
And under 200 milliseconds.
Okay, so it's funny. A long time ago, before I really knew what I knew now, I would call or I would talk with web hosts, and they would say, "Hey, that's not a server issue. That's not a server issue." They'd constantly say that. And while it's interacting with the WordPress platform, and there's some, you got to have optimization on both sides. I tested out 42 different platforms, right, to find one. It wasn't necessarily the number one fastest, because they didn't have some other features that I needed, but it was one of the faster ones, just because I was seeing, very, very well-known hosting providers over a second just in first time to byte. So that's something you definitely need to look at in your hosting provider. And if you want quick load times, obviously, if somebody's taking a second just to connect to your site and provide that information and start to load the page, that's obviously going to affect your load time. So why don't we keep going? This is a great screenshot here that we can just kind of bounce.
Can just to compare, can you open the previous one?
Yeah, I'll do that. So this is a perfect example, like you mentioned, right? So here's the 1.2 seconds of first time to byte. So
yes, so that is why it's taking, like, it just took 0.6 seconds, 600 milliseconds for the backend to get ready and respond. So that's where the server is, and once the server got connected in 300 milliseconds, it took 600 milliseconds to get connected, like 900 milliseconds in total to get connected, and then send the first byte back. And if you compare to the optimized one, the new one.
Yeah, hold on real quick. I'm just going to point this out. So that's 500 milliseconds roughly. That's a 0.6. You've already wasted a second right there, right? So that's what we're seeing in the waterfall before we can even really start seeing stuff load. But if I go here, we'll see it's 0, 51 milliseconds, and 24 milliseconds.
Yes. So once the server got the request, it just took 24 milliseconds to get back to the user. So that's where the TTIP comes in, and it's a very important metric, because if you're not good here, you already you're like, with us, the fully loaded time was 2 seconds after the optimization, but with previously it's 1.2 seconds just for the first byte. So that's why it's so important to start well here, because if you don't start well here, then it's a knockdown effect that follows.
Yeah, I think you could say this isn't a marathon. You're not supposed to start out kind of slow and warm into it. It's definitely this is the 100-meter dash here at the Olympics. You want to start off fast when the gun goes, right? So it's you want to be quick in the first 10 meters of the 100 meters. So
that's how users want it, right? Because nowadays, when especially, like, if you don't even have to look at studies, like, you can look at your own usage. Like, we all use websites every day, and like, it's every day. Like, if a website is slow, like, the website is already starting on a negative kind of a connotation for anyone that's coming there, right? That they won't be very much happy for that website. You'll only buy something if you're like very much, like, if they're the only one doing that thing, or they're the only one offering it. But otherwise, if you have options, they won't be the first choice. So so once the first main area that starts coming up where the page is the first paint and contentful paint. That the first paint basically means how long did it take for the first piece of, you can say, relevant information to get to the browser for the DOM. So normally, I've seen first paint and contentful paint are normally the same, and because that's where you can see it's 0.6, 0.6, because it normally happens at the same time if it's optimized. If the website is not optimized, then there might be a delay in this. But if it's optimized, so you get both of the things in the same time. So basically, because you have DOM, right, and document object model. So for people that they're not very technical, that's how, like, once the HTML code starts coming in, the basic DOM comes in, which tells the browser how the page is structured, how many elements does it have. So contentful paint means when the first piece of that information reaches the browser to start creating the page. So that's the main element of this. So that's what we start marking. So now the thing is that all these key points that are happening here affect your page speed scores as well, and the load time, because there are certain things that are because you cannot have these things happening fast if you're not following the best practices. Like, if you don't have critical CSS happening, if you don't have CSS which is not render blocking, if you don't have the JavaScript which is not render blocking, these things won't happen this fast. They'll happen slowly, and they'll like overlap with each other, and you'll have these big differences or big time differences between each element. So that would affect your page speed score. So that's why they're interrelated. So that's why I said, like, I normally don't see a website with like 100 page speed scores and a bad load time.
Yeah.
Because it can theoretically happen. It can, like, in theory it can happen, but it doesn't happen like that.
Yeah. So talk about, I mean, you kind of mentioned it to the DOM, versus the DOM fully loaded, right? And that's how some people measure speed differently, right?
Yes. So for GTmetrix, it measures all these things where you have the contentful paint, then you have DOM initialized on the, like, for this website, we can say it's on 0.6 seconds, on 600 milliseconds. The first contentful paint came in. on 700 seconds, so after 100 milliseconds, the DOM started initializing. So it's like when the page starts building itself. So when you go to a website, what you'll see is that certain things start coming up. So that's what DOM initialization is. That now the page has started to build out on the browser. So then we have the DOM loaded, where majority of the things of the DOM have been loaded. And normally, and onload means when the website is ready to use. So that's this all. If you count all this would come to 2 seconds. So approximately, they're not plus, like they're not what normally it looks like is like it's 75 milliseconds plus 6.6 seconds plus 0.6 seconds. It's not like that. It's like these things. Onload is a plus, so it's like it's a little technical in that sense, that how, because things happening at the same time, so they're not 600 milliseconds after the previous one, they're at the same time. So
they can run in parallel, is what you're saying.
Yes.
Yes.
So once you add all these, they come to 2 seconds of the load time. So that's where the difference starts coming in between tools, right? Because now what GTmetrix considers the onload is when the first fold that you're looking at is ready to use. The JavaScript has loaded, the CSS has loaded. But that's where our optimization is kicking in, because we want to make sure that we prioritize, because there's no use giving a user the footer when they're at the header, right? When they're at the first fold. So that's what we start doing, that we give them the first area that they have to be using, and like hold on all the images and everything that are like up underneath the fold, because the first page is ready to use, everything is ready, and by the time they've done with this and they start scrolling down, the things would be ready there as well. And that's when we pull them also. So that's what we do with lazy loading images. So we defer any non-essential JavaScript that's not needed until we detect user detection. So that is one of the key areas where some tools get it wrong, because we have purposefully done that to make the websites well optimized and to make the websites like load fast and also give a better experience. We've said, okay, and also for our servers as well, we want to make sure that our servers are not overloaded as well. So what we do is okay, let's only load certain things when we see people actually doing something on the website. So now that's what confuses some of the tools, that they keep waiting for that to happen, but it's purposefully done. So that's why, like I said, GTmetrix being one of the ones that are very close to how a real user will use it.
Yeah, I think great explanation. We're actually working with one of our partners right now inside their tool to help them identify how to properly measure load time, what we believe to be properly measured, because these tools, that's how they're measuring it. So this is where our clients go to measure it, to compare our results with them. So we want to make sure we're showing very similar results within a couple hundred milliseconds or seconds, tenths of a second. So that's not significantly different in regards to seconds, because then otherwise just questions start raised, and then we have to get into the technical conversation of the DOM load time and things like that. So, you mentioned lazy loading images. I think that's something you almost see on every caching tool that is used out there, is to do that, or deferred JavaScript or things like that, right? So let's just talk, quickly, obviously checking those things can make a difference in your site, and they can cause things to break, and you need to test them. I guess that's kind of where I'm going with that. And it's the process of turning one on, turning one off, turning one on, turning the next one on. Oh, which one conflicts with the other one to get it to work properly?
Yeah, because I think it's a lesson every kind of person who works with WordPress learns the hard way, that they download a plugin, a very good plugin, and they see, oh, there's so many nice things, and we activate it all, right? We want a website to be the best, so we activate it all, and then we go and the page is like pretty much broken.
Yeah.
So that's what like people, like I always say, it's one option, like do a couple of things, go back and check if it's working. So you don't have to roll back the whole thing. You know where the problems happen, because certain websites react certainly, because for some websites we've seen as in our experiments as well, most of our websites, like in our stack, once we are optimizing it, they go well very smoothly, because they're not using a lot of plugins. They're using like well maintained plugins, well maintained themes, so we don't have any problems. But occasionally we do get a site that has been using not very well maintained plugins or well maintained themes, and that's where things start getting a little kind of out of control, where everything that you are trying to do is breaking something. It's breaking some part of the functionality. And sometimes with WordPress, especially if you're using e-commerce like WooCommerce or any other tools, problem is that you just don't have to do a visual check of how the website is looking. You have to do a kind of functional check as well to make sure that it's functioning as well. All the WooCommerce, all the pages, all the checkout pages, cart pages are working properly, because things start happening there as well. Especially if you have server-side caching as well, because that's where I've seen most of the plugins that you have for caching in WordPress are very well optimized or kind of integrated or supporting WooCommerce and all that. So they make sure that they're not optimizing or they're not caching cart pages, checkout pages. But what in my experience I've seen that certain kinds of, if you're especially at a host that is not like WordPress focused, if they're like a standard host, like a shared hosting, especially like an environment where they're not configured for WordPress and they have server-side caching. So that's like a recipe for things going wrong, because then you'll have cart pages cached, you have a lot of things happening where pages which you don't want to be cached, because certain pages shouldn't be cached.
So your recommendation is to only have one of the two caching, usually just the site itself?
No, we do have server-side cachings as well, but only where, because we are focused on WordPress, right? We just work with WordPress and with other WordPress providers as well that are in the industry manage. What we do is, what all of us do is that on server side we have certain rules in place, because we know what kind of format the websites will follow. But if you're not on a host that is WordPress focused, then it's a very good chance that they have just server-side caching on, where it's caching everything. It's not caching selectively. So only if you have if you're working with any good provider, WordPress focused provider, like a managed WordPress provider, pretty much this is covered. They'll have these things in place, but still a good idea to check it out to make sure that's working.
Sure.
Because sometimes things go wrong. But we do also use server-side caching, which is we use normally Redis for that. Because which is one of the most leading ones. So we use that as well. But like I said, for us, it's very much like, it's not like a one size fits all, right? Once we get a website to look at it and we see, okay, like for example, on this one, I know that we're not using Redis because it was causing because it has a lot of video. So we know, okay, we don't want to use that. So for us, it's a lot of customization that have to go in for each website. And that's how it has to be. You can't have, for optimization, you can't have one kind of a thing that you fit on everyone.
Yeah, and I think that's a great point. And I think I mean, we could probably just talk a whole session just about the server-side caching using Redis and things like that, and maybe we will. Maybe that'll be the next one. I think we're at about 20 minutes right now. Let's talk.
Time flies. It's like it goes very fast on these videos.
Or when you're having fun talking about things we're very passionate about, right?
Yeah.
So we'll talk, about. But I think we should have. I mean, load time needs that much time of this meeting. I mean, of this video, because it's that important. So in the last 5 or 8 minutes, we'll kind of talk about total page size and number of requests. Obviously, when you're optimizing, the goal is to reduce the number of requests. Why don't you explain why that is? I'll just show again so that we can see. They had 290 requests before. The average is 88 based on what GT metrics shows, and now we have 13, right? So talk a little bit about that.
I think with WordPress, the number of requests, when we get a website which is not optimized, like if they're not optimized, like no one is looking at the optimization, normally it is like 170 to 200 requests. And I've seen like 290 is one of the, it's like kind of a not well optimized ones. But we normally see like 180 to 200 requests on average, because the thing is that you have a lot of, we tend to, because we have changed WordPress into a lot more like what it used to be. So WordPress has certain files, certain CSS files that are mandatory, and it will load. Then we have added a theme to it. Then we have added like 10, 20 plugins to it where we are doing different functionalities. So all of these have different CSS files, different JavaScript files, then there are images there. Then we have YouTube videos embedded. So all these things, when we are embedding them on the website, or when we're adding them on the website, they look very nice, right? We need them. But what we don't know what's happening in the backend is that it's adding a lot of files that have to be brought in for the page to load. So it can be images, it can be JavaScript files, it can be CSS files. So each plugin, each image that you embed, the things are happening with that. So once the page wants to load, it has to call in all those files, all those static files as well, all those image files, all those JavaScript files to make sure the page works. So that's why you see a huge number of requests, like in that example, 290. And that's one of the biggest impacts that happen on load time as well, because each request has to go, your browser has to send a request, bring in that file, then send a request, bring in that file. And if certain files are from external sources, where you're calling external, like you have live chat on your website, you have YouTube, or you have any other like plugins or any pixels on your website, they have to be called from external sources. And if you're using an external source that is not very, like it's not a big provider, then there's a chance that it can be slow. So it keeps your browser waiting for that to load. So there are certain things that are there in the request, like it's a whole topic in itself when it comes to requests, like how they work. But the core idea that should be known is that we have to have minimum requests for the page to be usable. Now, what happens, why it's at 13 here is because there are certain things that we do. Minification, like it's another feature that almost all plugins have. So we minify all the static files that are possible, and then we aggregate them as well. So we have a lot of CSS files. Say let's page has 10 CSS files. We bring it into one. It has a lot of JavaScript files. We bring them into one. So this way, we are, instead of sending out 20, 30, 40 requests for CSS files, JavaScript files, we are just sending out 2 requests. And then there are certain things, and one or more reason why it's slow, because we're not loading non-essential files at load. So if there are any JavaScript files that are needed for non-essential things, like for the footer or something like that, or any other embedded things, we are not loading them at first. We will load them if we need them, if the page needs them.
So explain that a little bit, like if the page needs them, if we scroll down, correct?
Yes,
like,
if we scroll down, if a person scrolls down and it kind of interacts with the page, because all websites get a lot of bots as well, right? So that's why a lot of times when you go on shared hosting websites, the servers are loaded because these things are not happening. So there are websites getting hundreds of bot requests in a day, even thousands. So the server is dealing them all as a normal human being. They're giving them everything. So we load for interaction. We wait for interaction. So once a user interacts, starts working with the website, then a certain amount of files go. But the number is drastically reduced because of aggregating CSS files, JavaScript files. That is one of the biggest impact that happens. And we aggregate a lot of CSS files into one. We aggregate all main JavaScript files into one. Certain files have to be loaded without aggregation because they're needed, but most of the files can be aggregated. That's where the concept of critical CSS came in as well. That's being like pushed by Google as well. Like there are tools for that as well. That you don't need the whole CSS at the start, right? You just need the critical CSS. So you load that first, and then let all the other CSS files in one file and let them load as the page gets loaded, right? Don't load it at the start. Don't make it render blocking, because CSS also becomes render blocking. It has to be loaded to make sure that the website gets loaded, so you start seeing the website.
Yeah.
It's not just JavaScript that get render blocking.
Yeah, no, I think all great points, and especially Google's pushing for that critical CSS early on. So anything you want to mention around, obviously when you're doing optimization, you have less requests, the total page size decreases, right? Do you want to talk a little bit about that?
It decreases because you're not loading non-essential things, right? And also you're not sending in a lot of information at first, because like I said, for us, the priority is to make the website usable on the first fold. So that gives us and the server time to make sure that every other thing is ready. So it's kind of like you give the user what he needs at this time, and while you prepare for all the other things. So that's why we see a page size also going down, because we're not sending it a lot of information. And the page size also goes down because we optimize the images very well. So that is also one area, because I think we mentioned before as well, because you can have websites where you have a lot of images, like this one also has, where the images are huge. They're like 3000 by 3000 pixels, which is an 8 MB image, when you actually need just 500 by 500. So what we do is we don't load the full image. We cut it out. We load the image that we need. So that also reduces the page size drastically as well, especially where there are a lot of images. So like this one, I think was 9 MB or something, and it came down to this. So one reason is we reduce the page speed, the image size, we optimize the images, we move them to a CDN, so they're loading faster. Then we also remove the non-essential things that are not needed at the time. So things like videos that are down in the page, things like that. So that's one area where the page size goes down.
Cool, great.
And server-side compression as well, because not many hosts have that also active. Especially if you're coming from a shared hosting, they might not have compression active on the host. We use Nginx, we have compression already active on the server, so it's compressing the files on server level as well. So each file that's going out is compressed, so that also helps.
Yeah, no, good points. Anything else that you want to mention as we wrap up episode 5 of the Crazy Optimizer?
No, I think for me, like I said at the start, load time has to be the key metric that a person has to, like an owner has to be monitoring and has to keep as the North Star. You can have page speed scores, you can have ISO scores, you can have any insights, anything, but the load time should be the North Star, where you should be focusing on it. Having something under 3 seconds at max low for your website. 2 seconds, under 2 seconds is much better if you want to be more future proof, but under 3 seconds at any cost. So I think that should be not for everything should follow for that. And it's not just for optimization, it's a certain mindset that a person has to follow. So that's what we've seen with our clients as well when they come to us, and they develop a certain mindset of being very performance focused, right? So there are certain things they also like make sure that they're loading good images, they're loading optimized images, they're loading huge images. So I think certain things, it's not just on the developers. You can't just like put everything on the developers side that, oh, you are the bad people here, you didn't make the website fast. It's certain things that we do as well as users of the website. So I think if the North Star is the load time, if we're thinking about that on the website and we are measuring that very aggressively, so I think that's where the focus should be on.
Yeah, exactly. I think that's a great point, because a lot of people just get enamored with the green color, right? And making sure that happens. But if you're able to somehow get the fully loaded time under a second, but you don't have amazing scores, I think that's more important, just because of the load time and the user experience. So thanks again for tuning in for episode 5 of the Crazy Optimizer. He's Abdul. I'm Michael. We're here from the WP Help, giving websites hope. Have a good day. Bye.
Bye.